Without skipping a beat, we will continue with the program, and we will take a look at the current state and the future of the transatlantic relations. We will take a look at this from a, I think, very important perspective via public opinion. We've already talked about it this morning, the Berlin Pulse. The Berlin Pulse is our publication. We bring out once a year. It offers opinion pieces by international decision makers and experts, and also a survey with the German and the US public. The idea is to juxtapose these two perspectives on foreign policy issues. We have trend questions we've been asking since 2017, and our cooperation partner, Pew Research, is asking the same questions in the US. As you can imagine, this offers a true treasury of information on the development of the transatlantic relations. And now I want to dive deeper into these results, and for this I asked my wonderful colleague Julianne Ganter to come on stage with me. Hi, Julia.
Hi, Lisa.
I actually haven't seen her today yet because she's been out and around talking about the results this morning.
Right.
So, Julia, let's start with a broad overview. What does the Pulse of this year tell us about the general state of transatlantic relations?
This is actually a great question to begin with, because it makes me start on a positive note. From a German perspective, the transatlantic relationship has never been rated as positive as it is rated in this year. 82% of Germans say that they perceive the transatlantic relationship as very good or good. And if you look at the graph that we're showing just up here, you can see that, for example, in comparison with 2020, when just shortly before the US election, only 18% of Germans have shared this view, that there's quite a big change going on in the past 2 years. But of course, there are some issues where Germans perceive the US more as a partner than in others.
Such as?
One example is European security. So the US is particularly seen as a partner when it comes to this issue. To be exact, 81% of Germans, they think that the US is a partner on the protection of European security. And this has also improved a lot compared to last year. And one possible explanation probably is the US's support for Ukraine since the beginning of the invasion. And staying on the subject, 6 out of 10 Germans, they also perceive the US as a partner when it comes to dealing with Russia. But Germans are also more divided on other issues, for example, on China, or don't perceive the US so much as a partner when it comes to climate.
And do Americans share these perceptions of Germany as a partner?
So the Pew Research Center, which is our cooperation partner, since 2017, they have found out in the US that the perception is rather similar when it comes to issues such as dealing with China and Russia. But the view differs quite a bit when it comes to the protection of European security that I've already talked about before, where few Americans perceive Germany as a partner than vice versa. Still, almost 7 out of 10 Americans also on this issue perceive Germany as a partner, so it's actually not too bad.
And Juliet, you just mentioned that a slight majority of both Americans and Germans perceive each other as partners when it comes to dealing with Russia and with China. So does that mean that they also have a similar perception of the threat posed by these two countries?
Actually, it's not the same perspective that they share in this question. For most Germans, China does not display a military threat for their country's security. This is what 51% say. And despite the Russian invasion, 1/4 of Germans, they also do not perceive Russia as a military threat to their security. It's actually a result that I found quite puzzling given the current setting. And if we compare these results with the US, we can do or have two observations. The first one is that more Americans perceive Russia and China as a military threat to their security. And the second observation is that Americans perceive Russia and China as equally threatening.
And so when we go back in time a bit and draw the line to today, no matter under which US administration, there's been one expectation that has always been there, that Germany should meet the target of the 2% of GDP on defense. So now we can say a lot has been going on in German defense policy since February 24th. Is that change also visible in the results?
I have to admit that there's a lot of continuity, but there is one result where we can definitely see a change, and this is the question on the defense investment in defense spending. 6 out of 10 Germans, they want their country to durably invest more money in defense, and we have posed similar questions in the past. For example, 2019, where only 4 out of 10 Germans were in favor of increasing the defense spending. So there's quite a change going on here.
Another challenging issue in the past for transatlantic relations was Germany's energy policy. Can we say now that with the lesson or with the experience with Russia, lessons have been learned?
I would say yes and no, because it depends on the perspective from which you look at this question. One could say that Germans have not learned their lesson, and I show you why. 55% of Germans, they say that Germany should purchase energy from all countries, independent of their political systems, or independent if they are democracies or not. And probably this result happened because there's this looming energy shortage and price explosions going on. So Germans have the feeling that they probably can't be too picky in this regard, and pragmatism trumps values. But one could also say that Germans have learned their lesson, namely that it is dangerous to be too dependent on only one country, and that we need to diversify our energy suppliers, and this is the reason that makes them less picky in this regard.
Thank you, Julia, for sharing your analysis and the results with us. For all of you who haven't gotten a copy yet, it's on the book table just behind us in the break area. For everyone at home, you can obviously download it on our website. And now, I will take a step back. Julia will dive a bit deeper into the analysis of transatlantic relations, and we have a wonderful guest, an expert on the transatlantic relations. Please join us in welcoming Julianne Smith.
Madam Ambassador, it's a great pleasure to have you with us here today. Being the US permanent representative of NATO since November 2021, and as I have read, calling yourself a NATO nerd, you have been serving in various positions in the White House, the State Department, and the Pentagon, amongst others as Deputy National Security Advisor to, at that time, Vice President Joe Biden, and more recently as a Senior Advisor to State Secretary Blinken. So I could not imagine a better person to talk about the future of transatlantic relations than with you today here. During your career, you have also worked in think tanks in the US, but also in Germany, to be more precise, here in Berlin. So you're familiar with the city also. And your current posting brought you to the heart of the EU, to Brussels. So as you're familiar with all these perspectives, all perspectives that one could probably cast on the transatlantic relationship, I would be really curious to know, to start with, what you think about the perspective of the public in Germany, but also in the US. What surprised you most when looking at these survey results?
Well, first, thanks to you for moderating this discussion. Thanks to the Körber-Stiftung for the invitation. It's great to be back in Berlin and see so many familiar faces and friends and have a chance to talk about this survey. A couple of things were not so surprising, and a few things created a few raised eyebrows, I think. But first, let me start with the positive, and that was the first slide that you put up there. I mean, really reflecting the state of the transatlantic bond, and more specifically, the US-German relationship, which I feel each and every day is stronger than it's ever been. We've fielded Zeitenwende inside the NATO alliance. We've seen real results. It's not rhetorical. There's real policy behind it. And I think we feel that, our publics feel that in this moment, not only is the German-US relationship quite strong and we're united in our support for Ukraine, but that we continue to do good work together in lots of other areas above and beyond the war. And I think the survey really reflects the state of the relationship, which is remarkable if you think of where we were just a few years ago, with folks questioning the purpose of the alliance, some folks questioning American commitment to the alliance. We're just in a much different place, and your survey really reflects that. In terms of what's surprising, or maybe I'd use the word disappointing, I really do see the gap there in how Germans and Americans look at climate as a transatlantic project. I think President Biden has been very clear in articulating that climate change is a key priority for him and for his administration, and I think he's already taken a number of steps to signal that in concrete terms. If you read our national security strategy that was just released last week, climate is a key feature of our national security strategy. And so I hope that those numbers will shift over time. I hope that Germans will look at the United States as a strong partner on climate change. And it seems like Americans have a little more confidence in that area of work. Lastly, the numbers on support for defense spending are, of course, encouraging, but reflect, I think, also a change here in Germany that we certainly welcome on the other side of the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm. So you have mentioned some continuity and changes in the past. One thing that could definitely change the transatlantic relationship again is the question of leadership in the US. And you will have your midterm elections in around 3 weeks. The Republicans, they're projected to take the House, and it remains a little bit more unclear what's going to happen in the Senate. So what should Europeans be prepared for? To what extent will the outcome of this midterm election impact the European-US, the transatlantic relationship?
Well, a couple of things on that. First, I wish I had a crystal ball, but alas, I do not. And so it's hard to predict politics really anywhere in the world right now, hard to predict how the midterms will come out. And certainly I know folks like to ask about 2024, but we don't know what's going to happen far into the future. But what we can say is right now, what we feel in the United States is a strong commitment, both among Democrats and Republicans, to the transatlantic relationship. And you see that not only in polling, where you've seen figures where we've had some of the highest approval ratings for the NATO alliance, a firm commitment to the alliance and a determination to stay in close coordination with our closest allies here in Europe. But you also see it in Congress, where I hear all the time, I welcome delegations that come through from the Senate, from the House, both Republicans and Democrats. I see no daylight between the two parties when it comes to NATO and the transatlantic relationship. So I have faith that irrespective of what may happen in the midterms or even far into the future, America is going to be able to stay the course, stay committed to this relationship, and that is widely supported by Americans across the country.
Mm-hmm. As you have already mentioned, the partisan differences when it comes to views on NATO, for example, one of your goals is to prevent NATO from becoming a partisan issue. That's what I've read about you. And in Germany, if we look at surveys, the dividing line is also geographically between Eastern and Western Germans. For example, Eastern Germans being a little bit less in favor of Finland and Sweden joining NATO. This is a result that we have found out this year. What advice would you share from your own experience and efforts in the US to avoid polarization in this regard?
Well, I will say that I have made that one of my goals in this particular role at the moment. Before you actually are shipped out to your post, you do a lot of what we call courtesy calls with members of Congress. And I was really struck as I was making the rounds on the Hill how many members were at pains to express their firm commitment to the alliance and their determination to keep it that way. And so I made a promise to myself that I would also work to not only welcome delegations from Congress, but really here my advice both to Americans and Germans would be to engage the next generation. I mean, I think we've got to do more to break out of the usual cycles. We like to have conversations like this with folks that operate in the sphere of foreign policy on a regular basis. But I think bringing the conversation out to other cities, other locations, different audiences, people who maybe don't make a career out of foreign policy, but are hungry to talk about national security issues. That's something that I did with some colleagues at the Center for New American Security. One of them's here, I think Rachel Rizzo is in the audience. We worked very hard to travel across the United States to have those conversations in Salt Lake City, in Atlanta, in Pittsburgh, wherever it may be, to reach out to different sets of audiences. So it takes some work, but I think investing in a wider set of conversations with different populations is time well spent.
So we should focus on the next generation. That is one of the points you have mentioned now. An act that has been that passed recently in the US is the Inflation Reduction Act, that also points to the future because it treats quite a bit of measures with regards to climate change, but it's also an act that incentivizes domestic production and is perceived by Europe as unbalanced subsidies. That's how it was referred to by some senior European officials. The European Commission Vice President Margrethe Vestager, she said last week in reaction to the act, "You should not put this up against friends." I'm quoting her here. To what extent is the act compatible with the transatlantic friendship from your regard?
Well, I really probably am not the best person to talk to about that particular act. What I will say is that if you look at the national security strategy that was just released a couple of days ago, last week, there is a heavy emphasis in that strategy on increasingly bridging foreign policy with domestic policy. And that cuts lots of different ways. I think we're all trying to figure out how to best tackle some of the domestic challenges we face, whether it's protecting some of our critical infrastructure, getting to supply chains, talking about tax policies. These are subjects that are increasingly coming into our foreign policy discussions. I know we have differences. There are differences of perspectives on both sides of the Atlantic as it relates to some of these issues. But again, I guess I put my faith in the fact that, look, we've had differences amongst ourselves for 73 plus years, certainly across the NATO alliance and beyond, even in the EU-US space, and we continually find ways to navigate it. We do come to the table with different histories, different sets of relationships, different domestic policies that don't mirror one another necessarily. But again, I have full confidence that we'll be able to take this on and navigate those differences.
So you have just mentioned the national security strategy that was published last week, so it's hot off the press.
It is.
And Europe or the EU was mentioned 43 times within this document.
I wasn't counting, but thanks for that. Yeah.
Yeah. We were counting. So I was wondering, can Europe sit back now as the US has returned, as Europe has returned center stage on the US's foreign policy radar?
No, no one can sit back. I think we've got a lot of work to do together. But I think what you see in the national security strategy is a reflection of how the president and his team really are looking at the future challenges we may face, the current challenges that we face, and the theme, you're right, that really the thread that moves throughout the strategy is an emphasis on allies and partners. And that is the cornerstone of addressing everything from climate change to the war in Ukraine to cyber attacks to a variety of transnational challenges, you name it. And the Biden administration is making a conscious investment in revitalizing our alliances. You heard the president talk about this on the campaign trail, and that's very much now reflected in the strategy. But in terms of stepping back, of course, some Europeans may find it reassuring to see Europe feature so prominently, or allies and partners. But you'll also note, if you read the strategy closely, that the emphasis is both on what's happening in Ukraine as it relates to Russia's war there, but also on China as the pacing threat, an issue that we believe will be with us for quite some time. And we want to put policies in place with our transatlantic allies to ensure that we can tackle those challenges and so that we can compete. We call it kind of a challenge for us to face together. And I think we have to think about building resilience, developing better tools to counter hybrid tactics, thinking about how to cope with not just the PRC and Russia individually, but how you cope with those two together and the evolving relationship between those two nations. So we have plenty of work to do, and that's just to mention Russia and the PRC. Of course, there are countless other challenges. But personally, I was very reassured by the fact that the national security strategy did feature our allies, and specifically Europe, so prominently.
So I'm going to come back definitely to the issue of China in a minute, but as you have mentioned, this plethora of different challenges, and Germany is currently also the German government is writing its own and first ever national security strategy that's supposed to be published early next week. I wanted to ask you about something that Chancellor Scholz said recently. He said the national security strategy will put territorial and alliance defense first. So does this approach match then the expectations of the US, or is Germany stacking the deck too low, given all those examples that you have given with regard to the broad challenges, climate change, China's muscle play in the Indo-Pacific and other areas?
Well, I'm going to be a little bit presumptuous and assume that that also applies more broadly to the NATO alliance. And if I'm correct in that assumption, it's not just about territorial defense here in Germany, but NATO territory. That reflects what we just did at the Madrid summit this past summer, where we rolled out the first strategic concept that we've had in 12 years. The last one was written in 2010. And if you read the strategic concept closely, you see a heavy emphasis on deterrence and defense. NATO's three core tasks are mentioned. Crisis prevention and cooperative security are mentioned as well. But the beating heart of the strategic concept really rests with deterrence and defense. That is what we're spending most of our time on inside the NATO alliance right now. We're ensuring that we can execute and implement the decisions surrounding our new deterrence and defense posture. And what we've applauded is for Germany to support the alliance and develop its own policies and make the necessary investments to ensure that we can deliver on that particular promise. So that sounds, again, right to me, assuming you can widen the aperture a little bit and make sure that it applies to all NATO territory.
You mentioned the NATO Madrid summit. Another meeting that took place recently was the meeting of the NATO defense ministers, and they have agreed on a 10-year plan for Ukraine. And the prospect is that Ukraine will be a high-tech weaponry militarized country. How far away is NATO of becoming party of this war going on?
It's not close at all, becoming a party to the conflict. The one thing that we've agreed throughout this entire war as allies at 30 around the NAC table is that we will not allow NATO to become a party to the conflict. That was a decision that was taken very early on, and I see no cracks in the unity as it relates to that policy. I think we are firm in our decision not to provide lethal assistance individually almost all of us are providing humanitarian, economic, and security assistance, but NATO itself is not coordinating the assistance, nor is it providing the assistance. We are not sending NATO troops into Ukraine. There are no NATO commanders, nothing as it relates to NATO assets that exist inside Ukraine, and I don't expect that to change. What's unfortunate is the Russians have been so successful in putting forward a whole series of false narratives and falsehoods as it relates to NATO's role on the ground in Ukraine. They would love nothing more than to be able to continue to point to some instance of NATO getting directly involved in this conflict, but we are adamant that we are not going to allow that to happen, and right now we have the contact group led by the United States between the Pentagon and EUCOM leading the coordination on the security assistance side, and again, individual allies providing security assistance to Ukraine.
And do you think that this is also a differentiation that is seen in the Kremlin, that NATO is not directly coordinating?
I cannot get into the heads of Russian policymakers or Vladimir Putin, but I hope folks understand in Moscow. I think we've been crystal clear in all of our messaging from day one, and even before February 24th, we made that clear. We have to ensure also that friends and partners around the world also understand that. Occasionally, in various corners, you do hear countries asking hard questions. You know, is NATO, or not hard questions, but questions that reflect the Russian falsehoods. Is NATO on the ground? Is NATO providing lethal support? Is NATO to blame for this war? And so NATO allies are united also in their approach not only to talk to their own publics about what NATO is and is not doing in Ukraine, but we're also united in our view that we've got to get out in the world and have broader sets of conversations with other countries that may be asking whether or not those Russian falsehoods have any relevance or truth.
Mm-hmm. I've promised that I'm going to come back to the issue of China, so that's what I'm going to do now. Because the NSS talks about outcompeting China by aligning efforts with partners and allies. So this made me curious to understand better what could be concrete examples where the US government sees opportunities to align efforts with Europe in this regard.
Well, there's so many opportunities. Maybe I'll start by talking a little bit about NATO, but really what's clear is there's a piece for us to work as Germany and the United States. There's a piece for the EU to work with the US on the China challenge, and there's a piece for the NATO alliance as well. I think what was interesting about the Madrid summit was for the first time the strategic concept actually mentions China, the Indo-Pacific, and the relationship between China and Russia. That was a major development for the alliance, and I think signals that the alliance is increasingly concerned about what China is doing in and around the Euro-Atlantic area. Increasingly, allies are asking questions about whether or not some of the investments that the PRC makes in the Euro-Atlantic space creates any potential security vulnerabilities for allies. So we want to take the language in the strategic concept and do some good work in that space as it relates particularly to resilience. That is an area where the alliance has signaled an intent to do more work as it relates to building societal resilience around things like cyber, around things like critical infrastructure. There's a whole array of subjects where we could do more work in the space of resilience. What bothers me a little bit about this debate is sometimes I hear folks say, well, maybe what the United States is proposing inside the NATO alliance is for NATO to go off and sail ships into the South China Sea, or NATO should start thinking about members across the Indo-Pacific, or NATO should somehow start a conversation about Taiwan. I think the goal here is not necessarily any of those things that are sometimes put forward, but again, to talk as allies about what the PRC is doing, how it's operating, some of the hybrid tactics that it's using and also learning to use from the Russians, and think about as an alliance, what can we do in the NATO lane, what can we do in the EU-US lane? I think there's plenty of good work to be done there.
As we have run out of time already, I just want to ask you a very brief question. If you think about the transatlantic relationship in 5 years from now, and you have to pick one word to describe the condition it will be in 5 years from now, what word would that be?
I don't get 50 words. It's strong. I'm very optimistic. I'm very optimistic of where the relationship is headed. We will continue to be united. I think we will continue to do great work together. I think we will be increasingly resilient. We will be prepared. We will be capable. Sorry, I'm breaking the rules.
More than one word.
But I'm very optimistic about where we'll be.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. I've started on a positive note with the presentation. Now you have ended on a positive note also. The French ambassador to NATO once said that if there's one person to help NATO recover from Trump PTSD, it would be you. And I can definitely say that you have proved her right today. And even if we have to end here, the discussion about transatlantic relations is going to continue, not at least because we will have Secretary General Stoltenberg joining us later today. But for now, there will be a coffee break, and I kindly ask you to be back at 3:30 sharp to watch the discussion with Kevin Rudd on the question where China is headed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.